The gun was already at his temple when James Harris made his decision. Not the decision most people would expect. Not fight, not flee. The decision was smaller than that. He let a 2-liter bottle of soda slip from his fingers. It hit the linoleum with a hollow thud. That was all he needed. His left hand found the pressure point at the base of the gunman's skull before the echo died. His right palm drove upward into the wrist holding the gun. A precise, geometric strike. The snap of bone was quiet, almost polite. The pistol clattered to the floor. The gunman folded. For seconds, the second robber charged with a knife held low. James didn't retreat. He moved into the attack, redirecting the man's momentum with his own arm, then brought the hard cylinder of a paper towel roll across the throat with controlled, devastating force. The man went down gurgling, clawing at his neck. 39 more seconds. Silence swallowed the store. James turned, knelt, opened his arms. "It's okay, Lily. Daddy's here." The 8-year-old crawled out from behind the cereal boxes and buried herself in his chest. His large hands, permanently stained with grease, split at the knuckles. The hands of a man who fixed things for a living wrapped around her completely. Nobody in the Greenfield market moved. Not the cashier. Not the elderly woman still, clutching her purse. Not the well-dressed man pressed flat against the floor in a $1,000 suit, staring at the back of a janitor's jacket with an expression he had never worn before in his life. Arthur Sterling, CEO of Sterling Enterprises, had just watched a man dismantle 2 armed criminals with the clinical efficiency of someone who had done far worse in far darker places, for reasons he clearly had no interest in revisiting. Sterling didn't get up immediately. He stayed on the floor, thinking. The police arrived 6 minutes later. By then, the 2 robbers were sitting propped against the soup can display, wrists zip-tied with the plastic strips. James had calmly asked the cashier for one of them, still moaning softly about his broken wrist. The other staring at the ceiling with the 1,000-yard look of a man who has just experienced a profound and humbling recalibration of his life choices. James had returned to holding Lily, his back to the room, completely unbothered. You are not going to believe who this man really is or what happened next. Subscribe, so you never miss a story like this. We find these people every single week. James Harris had been cleaning Sterling's building for 3 years. Sterling had never once noticed him. That fact, more than anything else that happened that evening, was what kept the CEO awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his penthouse while the city hummed 40 stories below. He poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink, sat in a chair he didn't remember sitting in, and thought about a janitor he had walked past hundreds of times without registering as a human being. To understand James Harris, you have to go back. Not to the grocery store, not even to the night shift janitor job or the grease-stained mechanic's garage. You have to go back further. Back to a young man who grew up in the Eastfield projects with his grandmother, a woman named Ruth, who was about 5'2" in thick-soled shoes and had a personality roughly the size of a freight train. Ruth Harris raised James the way she raised everything, with ferocious, unsentimental love and zero tolerance for self-pity. When James was 12 and came home complaining that his teacher didn't like him, Ruth looked at him over her reading glasses and said, "Then be so competent she can't afford to dislike you." When he was 16 and got into a fight at school, not starting it but certainly finishing it, she didn't ground him. She signed him up for a community boxing program on Tuesday nights. "You clearly have energy that needs a direction," she told him. "This is a direction." He was good at it, embarrassingly good. By 18 he had been offered 2 things: a partial athletic scholarship to a state school, and a conversation with an army recruiter who had watched him spar for 10 minutes and then sat very still for a moment before speaking. James chose the army. Ruth nodded once, said, "Don't do anything stupid." Made him his favorite meal, baked chicken, rice, and her particular brand of hot sauce that she refused to share the recipe for, and sent him off with a packed bag and a handshake. That turned into a hug that lasted considerably longer than either of them had planned. He was good at soldiering the way some people are good at mathematics, naturally, almost effortlessly, in a way that made his instructors simultaneously proud and vaguely unsettled. He absorbed tactics the way other men absorbed weather. He had an almost preternatural ability to read environments and people, to sense the shape of a situation before it fully formed, to know which door was about to open before the handle turned. By 24, he had been quietly recruited into a special operations unit whose name he was not technically permitted to say at dinner parties, not that he went to many dinner parties. His first deployment was to a region that the evening news described in broad strokes, and he knew in granular, exhausting detail. He came back quieter, not damaged, not yet, just compressed like a spring that had been wound a turn or two tighter than the manufacturer intended. His second deployment was harder. A mission went sideways in the way that missions occasionally go sideways, which is to say completely and without warning, and James lost a man named Carter who had been his closest friend for 4 years and who owed him $20 from a bet about a football game that James had never collected, because he kept thinking there would be time. He came back from the second deployment and sat in his apartment for 3 days without speaking to anyone, which worried his commanding officer enough to send someone to check on him. The someone they sent was a compact, serious woman named Dr. Elaine Cho, a military psychologist who James immediately identified as approximately the only person on base he could not read in the first 30 seconds. He found this so interesting that he actually talked to her. "You're going to tell me what you're feeling," she said at their first session. "I feel fine," James said. "That's not a feeling, that's a posture," she replied. "Try again." He tried again. It took 6 sessions and considerable effort, but he got there. The grief for Carter. The particular, grinding exhaustion of being very good at something. He had increasing moral complexity about the strange displacement of returning to ordinary life and finding it somehow both desperately welcome and slightly unreal, like watching a movie of the world through a pane of slightly smudged glass. Dr. Cho listened to all of it. Then she said something that James would think about for years afterward. "You've been trained to solve problems by force," she said. "The problem is that most of life's real problems can't be solved that way. You're going to have to learn a different kind of strength, the kind that looks like patience, like presence, like being willing to just sit in a room with someone and not fix anything." He was 28. He had one more deployment ahead of him and didn't know it yet. The third deployment was also the last. He could not discuss the specifics. He never would. What he could say, what he said. Only once, years later, to a man named Arthur Sterling over a conference table, was that he came home from that one having made a decision. The decision was simple and total. He was done. Not broken. Not bitter. Just done. He left the army with an honorable discharge, a service record that certain people in certain agencies occasionally looked at with a kind of reverent disbelief, a moderate case of hearing loss in his left ear from an incident he declined to elaborate on, and a 2-year-old daughter named Lily whose mother had decided, reasonably, that she could not build a life around a man who disappeared and came back different each time. He didn't fight it. He understood it. He took Lily, rented an apartment, called in a favor from an old friend to get a position at a garage, and began the long, quiet, deliberate project of becoming someone who came home every night. He was 30. He had been many things. Now he was going to try being a father. The garage was run by a man named Pete Okafor, who was 63, built like a comfortable armchair, and had the best instincts for broken engines James had ever encountered outside of a technical manual. Pete didn't ask many questions. He watched James work for 2 days, saw the way he listened to engines, genuinely listened, the way a doctor listens to a chest, and gave him a raise on the 3rd day without any particular ceremony. "You hear things," Pete said. It wasn't a question. "Engines are logical," James replied. "They tell you what's wrong if you're quiet enough to hear it." Pete nodded slowly. "Same is true of most things," he said, and went back to work. They got along extremely well. The money from the garage was honest but insufficient. The city had the particular cruelty of cities that are expensive to live in, which is that they price out the very people who keep them running. James did the math one evening: rent, food, Lily's daycare, utilities, and found himself about $400 short of solvent every month. He thought about this for approximately 1 day. Then he found a second job. He became a janitor. Specifically, he joined a cleaning crew contracted to service Sterling Enterprises, a corporation whose glass and steel headquarters pierced the city skyline like a geometric argument about ambition. He worked the night shift, moving through the silent floors from 10 until 2 in the morning, then sleeping for hours before his alarm called him back to the garage. He ran on black coffee, quiet determination, and the specific energy that fathers of small children develop, a kind of compressed, tireless purpose that has no particular name but is instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever lived it. He was, by any reasonable measure, exhausted, but in the way that matters most. In the part of himself where Lily lived, he was inexhaustible. He would come home at 2:30 in the morning smelling of industrial cleaner and creep into her room just to watch her sleep. The soft rise and fall of her chest. The way she always kicked one leg out from under the blanket. The total, absolute trust of a sleeping child. He would stand there for 2 minutes exactly. He'd counted once, curious, and then go to bed feeling, against all reasonable evidence, like a wealthy man. To understand why James Harris affected Arthur Sterling so profoundly, you first have to understand Arthur Sterling, which is to say, you have to understand a man who had spent 40 years being extremely successful at something he had chosen primarily because he was good at it, and only occasionally paused to wonder whether being good at something was a sufficient reason to organize your entire life around it. Arthur Reginald Sterling, the middle name, was a source of significant private suffering, was born in the suburbs to parents who were comfortable, competent, and largely incurious about the world beyond their immediate zip code. He was the smartest person in most rooms he entered as a child, which is an experience that can go one of 2 ways. It can produce humility, a recognition that the rooms were simply small, or it can produce a particular brand of confidence that is almost indistinguishable from arrogance until it gets tested. Arthur's confidence was tested exactly once before the night at Greenfield Market. He was 26, running his first company, a small logistics firm and a supplier. Decision he had made with complete certainty turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The company survived. He learned. He became more careful. What he did not become in the wake of that lesson was humble. He became precise. There is a difference. Precision is a tool. Humility is a posture. Sterling mastered the tool and largely ignored the posture, and for 20 years this approach produced results that financial magazines found extremely interesting and his ex-wife found somewhat exhausting. He had one daughter, Victoria, who was 15 and lived with her mother and texted him memes occasionally with no explanatory context, which he found baffling and secretly delightful. He had a penthouse apartment that was photographed for an architecture magazine and then never really lived in, more inhabited than lived in, the way a hotel room is inhabited. He had a security detail he trusted with his physical safety and a board of directors he trusted with approximately nothing. He was not, by his own admission, a particularly warm man. He was fair, he was rigorous, and he was genuinely committed to building something that lasted. But the word that came to mind when his employees described him, the word they used when they were being honest, which was not always in the same moment as when they were being polite, was distant. Not cold, distant. The difference being that cold implies active indifference, while distant implies a kind of preoccupation, a sense that the man was always on some level somewhere else. He was somewhere else when he stopped at Greenfield Market on a Tuesday evening. He had dismissed his security detail an hour earlier. He did this sometimes, needing the particular relief of being temporarily anonymous, and was standing in front of the organic milk thinking about a board meeting scheduled for Thursday, a quarterly projection that didn't quite add up, and whether he'd remembered to call his daughter back. When the doors flew open and the Tuesday evening became something else entirely, he dropped to the floor with everyone else. This was not cowardice. It was the correct, tactical response. Sterling was a rational man. He understood the geometry of the situation immediately. Two armed men, chaotic energy, a space with no good exits. He pressed himself against the cold linoleum, slowed his breathing, and began calculating. He was still calculating when James Harris, 3 feet to his left, quietly ended the situation. Sterling lay on the floor for a long moment after it was over. Around him, people were beginning to stir, to cry, to call loved ones with shaking hands and high voices. The cashier had sat down heavily on the floor and was staring at nothing. The elderly woman was being helped up by a teenage boy who had appeared from somewhere in the back of the store. Sterling watched none of this. He watched James Harris kneel on the floor in a janitor's jacket and pull a small girl out from between the cereal boxes and hold her with the particular focused tenderness of a man who has decided that this right here is the most important thing in the world, and everything else can wait. Something shifted in Arthur Sterling in that moment. He couldn't have named it precisely. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was more like the experience of having a mirror held up at an unexpected angle and seeing yourself from a perspective you didn't know existed. He realized, also a father. He was a father who had not held his daughter with that kind of complete, unhurried focus in a very long time. He got up off the floor, brushed his suit, walked over to the man in the janitor's jacket, and the conversation that followed, which James would later describe to Pete Okafor as the strangest thing that has ever happened to me, including several things I'm not allowed to talk about, changed both of their lives. James is about to walk into that building as something entirely different from what he walked out of it as. If the story is hitting different, hit like it tells us to, keep finding people like James Harris. He rode the elevator to the 42nd floor on a Wednesday morning and was immediately, almost comically, out of place. The Sterling Enterprises headquarters was the kind of office that had been designed by someone with very strong opinions about the relationship between workspace, aesthetics, and productivity. There was a lot of glass. There were plants that looked Too perfect to be real and turned out, on closer inspection, to be real. There was a coffee station that offered 17 options and had a small placard explaining the provenance of each bean, which James read once with an expression of polite bewilderment and never read again. The receptionist on 42 recognized him from the janitorial crew and did an almost imperceptible double-take, the kind that very professional people produce when they are surprised but have been trained not to show it. "Mr. Harris," she said, because Sterling had apparently told her to expect him. "He's ready for you." James nodded. "Is there regular coffee anywhere?" There was. She found him some. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Sterling did not perform. He sat across from James with a legal pad and asked questions. Real questions, and listened to the answers with the focused attention of a man who had finally understood he had been hiring the wrong thing for years. He had been hiring credentials, resumes, men who looked like security. He had not been hiring judgment. By the end of the first hour, he had learned more about situational security than in 20 years of briefings from professionals who billed by the hour. James explained it the way he explained everything, plainly, precisely, without performance. "Most security is reactive," James said. "Someone identifies a threat, they respond. The problem is that response is always behind. By the time you're responding, the situation has already happened." "And what's the alternative?" Sterling asked. "You build an environment where threats can't develop undetected. You talk to people. You listen. The people who know most about what's wrong in any building are the people everyone ignores." He paused. "The janitors, the kitchen staff, the guy who delivers mail. They see everything. They're invisible, so people don't perform around them." Sterling wrote something on his legal pad. He underlined it twice. "What do you actually need to do this?" he asked. "Autonomy," James said. "I don't work by committee. If I tell you there's a threat, we move. If I tell you a person is wrong for access, they don't get access. No politics." Sterling nodded. "What else?" "My daughter's school is 40 minutes from my apartment. I need to be closer." "Done. And I keep my mechanic's license current. That's mine. Not negotiable." Sterling studied him. "Why?" "Because it keeps me honest," James said. "Reminds me what things actually cost." Sterling set down his pen. "One more question. The bottle. You picked it up before any of it escalated. Why?" James was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted something in my hand that wasn't a weapon," he said. "I was hoping I wouldn't need to do anything at all." Sterling set down his pen and was quiet for a moment that felt larger than its actual duration. "Mr. Harris," he said finally, "that answer is worth more to me than everything else we've discussed." James Harris started on a Monday. His official title was Head of Global Security. His unofficial title, which he neither requested nor acknowledged, was the one that spread through Sterling Enterprises by Tuesday afternoon via the particular ecosystem of office gossip, which is to say, instantly and with considerable embellishment. The story of the grocery store had been told and retold in the break rooms and elevator banks of Sterling Enterprises until it had acquired several details that James would not have recognized. In one version, he had disarmed for men. In another, he had used a frozen turkey. He heard this version from a junior analyst who was deeply embarrassed upon realizing mid-telling that he was telling it to the man in question. "Just to clarify," James said pleasantly, "paper towel roll." The analyst nodded very quickly and left. He spent the first 2 weeks walking the building. Not inspecting it, walking it. There is a difference, and James understood the difference instinctively. An inspection is top-down. You arrive with a checklist and you confirm or deny the items on it. A walk is different. You move through a space with your checklist set aside and you pay attention to what the space is actually telling you, which is frequently different from what the checklist would have you ask. He introduced himself to the maintenance staff, the kitchen workers, the mailroom team, the security guards on the lobby desk, and the night cleaning crew, his former colleagues, who regarded him with a mixture of pride and the particular bemusement of people watching someone from their world ascend to a different altitude. "You're still going to say hi, right?" asked a man named Domingo, who had worked the 9th floor for 7 years and who had taught James 6 months into his janitor tenure the precise angle at which to hold a mop to avoid leaving streaks on the particular marble they used in the executive bathrooms. "Domingo," James said, "I'm going to have lunch with you on Thursday." Domingo seemed satisfied with this. He asked the maintenance staff and kitchen workers what felt wrong, what they'd noticed, what made them uneasy. He asked it the way Pete Okafor asked about engines, quietly, without urgency, with the patient body language of someone who has time and means it. They told him things they had never told anyone because no one had ever asked. A delivery driver who came at irregular hours and always paid in cash for parking. A minor thing, probably nothing, but a pattern that sat wrong. A third-floor emergency door that was supposed to lock automatically but had been sticking open for 3 weeks because the work order had gotten lost in a backlog. A pattern of after-hours access. Badge requests, mostly from one department, that when James mapped them on a calendar, formed a shape that made him go very still for a long moment before picking up the phone. The access badge pattern turned out to be a mid-level manager who was running a side business using company resources after hours. Not a security threat in the dramatic sense, no one was in danger, but the kind of insider access abuse that, left unchecked, creates the conditions for something more serious later. James brought it to Sterling with a 1-page summary and a recommended course of action. Sterling read it. "How did you find this?" "I talked to the woman who cleans that floor," James said. "She noticed the lights were on in that office 3 nights a week around midnight. She'd mentioned it to her supervisor 6 months ago. No one followed up." Sterling looked at the name of the cleaning woman in the report. He made a note to himself separate from the security matter. The note said, "Send a personal thank you." It was a small thing. It was the beginning of something larger. Within 60 days, James had quietly closed 3 security vulnerabilities. The sticky emergency door was repaired. The delivery driver was flagged and his access was reviewed. He turned out to be entirely legitimate, just eccentric about payment, but the review process itself identified 2 other drivers whose credentials had lapsed. The after-hours situation was resolved through HR with minimal drama. He filed no triumphant reports. He fixed the problems and moved on. Sterling heard about it anyway. He always did. He had the particular executive skill of knowing what was happening in his organization without being told, the way a conductor hears individual instruments without watching them. He stopped by James's office, a modest room on the 38th floor that James had furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard, and a coffee maker, declining. The interior designer Sterling had offered on a Thursday afternoon. 3 vulnerabilities in 60 days, Sterling said. 4, James corrected. The 4th one you don't know about yet. I'm finishing the report. Sterling sat in one of the 2 chairs. It was a perfectly functional chair. Nothing about it suggested it had been selected by someone with opinions about furniture. He found this restful in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The previous security director had this office for 8 years, Sterling said. He filed quarterly reports. They were very thorough, very well formatted. Did they tell you anything useful? Sterling considered this. They told me what I already knew, organized in a way that was easy to file. James nodded slowly. That's the most expensive kind of report. The team that assembled around James over the following weeks was not the team anyone would have predicted. He poached one person from the existing security department, a former police detective named Sandra Reeves, who had spent 5 years trying to get her supervisors to listen to her instincts and had stopped trying. She was precise, funny in a completely dry way that took people by surprise, and had the particular skill of making people feel comfortable enough to tell her the truth. He hired a young data analyst named Marcus Webb, who had been working in the actuarial department and had built, in his own time, a model for predicting internal security incidents based on behavioral patterns in access data. Marcus had tried to show this model to 3 different managers and been thanked politely and ignored. James looked at it for 20 minutes and offered him a position the same afternoon. You actually read it, Marcus said, visibly startled. It's good work, James said. Why wouldn't I read it? Marcus didn't have an answer to this, because in his experience the question had always been rhetorical. The third hire was the one that made Sterling's executive assistant momentarily stop typing when she saw the paperwork come through. James had offered a full-time position to Domingo, the 9th floor janitor, as a facility intelligence specialist, a role James had invented specifically to formalize what Domingo already did naturally, which was notice everything. He's been in this building for 7 years, James told Sterling when the hire was queried. He knows every stairwell, every door, every pattern of movement. He knows which conference rooms smell like someone's been smoking in them and which bathrooms have a window that doesn't close all the way. He's a resource. We've just been wasting him on a mop. Sterling approved the hire. Domingo, when offered the position, was quiet for a long moment. Does it pay more? He asked. Significantly, James said. Do I still have to clean the executive bathroom on 9? Absolutely not. Domingo nodded. Okay then. At the next all-hands meeting, Sterling stood at the podium and said something he had never said in 20 years of running the company. I want to tell you about something that happened to me in a grocery store. He told the whole story. He didn't clean it up or make himself look good. He described lying on the floor, powerless, watching a man in a janitor's jacket do what no one in his professional security detail had ever trained for. He described walking into a building the next morning and realizing he had passed the same man with a mop hundreds of times without registering his existence. He paused there for a moment. Let it sit. I've spent 20 years believing that talent announces itself, he said. That value rises naturally to the surface. That if someone was exceptional, the system would find them and reward them. I built this company on that belief. Another pause. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that is uncomfortable to stand here and admit, and I am admitting it anyway because I think we need to hear it. He talked about what James had found in the first 60 days. Not to embarrass anyone. He named no names but to make the point visceral. That the people who had been invisible had been carrying information the entire time. That the system had not failed to find this information. The system had failed to ask. We are changing that, he said. Not with a memo. Not with a committee. We are changing it by changing how we listen and who we listen to and whether we are willing to be wrong in front of each other. He got a standing ovation. He stood there looking faintly uncomfortable with it, which was the most human anyone in the company had ever seen him look. In the back, standing near the door with his arms folded, James Harris listened. He didn't shift or look away. When it was over, he went back to work. Sandra Reeves fell into step beside him in the hallway. "Nice speech," she said. "It was," James agreed. "You're not going to say anything else about it, are you?"
No.
"Didn't think so." She considered this. "Want coffee?" "Always." That evening, he picked Lily up from her new school, 12 minutes from their new apartment in a neighborhood where the trees were old and the sidewalks were wide, and the sound at night was crickets rather than sirens, and they walked to a park neither of them had been to before. She ran ahead. She always ran ahead. She had inherited something from him. Not the combat training, not the tactical mind, but some essential quality of forward motion, of moving toward things rather than away from them, that James recognized and quietly cherished. She found a swing and looked back at him with the expression that needed no words. He set down his coffee and went to push her. She laughed. The sound rose above the noise of the city. What little city noise reached them here, and hung in the evening air for a moment, clean and unhurried, before the breeze took it. James Harris smiled. Not the small, careful smile he had worn for 3 years of double shifts and borrowed energy and getting by. The full, unhurried smile of a man who had finally, after a very long time, arrived somewhere he intended to stay. He pushed the swing again. She laughed again. He thought about Carter, who owed him $20. He thought about Ruth, who had made him bake chicken and sent him into the world with a hug that went longer than planned. He thought about Pete Okafor, who he'd called last week and who had said, "Good, good, you were wasting yourself," and then immediately launched into a story about a carburetor problem that James had diagnosed over the phone in 4 minutes. His mechanic's license tucked in his wallet where it would stay, keeping him honest. He thought about Domingo, who had texted him a gif of a man in a hard hat giving a thumbs up on his first day as facility intelligence specialist. James had stared at this for a moment, then sent back a thumbs up emoji, which was approximately the limit of his GIF literacy. He thought about Lily. He was always thinking about Lily. She was right in front of him, which was where she should be, where he had organized his entire world to ensure she would be, and every time he remembered this, he felt something that he had once described to Dr. Elaine Cho in their 6th session together in a small office on a military base as not quite happiness, more like rightness, like when an engine finally settles into the correct timing. Dr. Cho had written that down. She said it was the best description of peace she had heard from anyone in 8 years of military psychology. He pushed the swing again. The evening settled around them, warm and unhurried. James Harris didn't ask to be found. He was just doing what he always did, showing up, doing the work, protecting what mattered. Share the story with one person who needs to be reminded that strength doesn't always announce itself. And tell us in the comments, who is the James Harris in your life? We read every single one. Every single week we go looking for people like him. Subscribe so you're there when we find them. The story of James Harris and Arthur Sterling is not a story about a dramatic reversal of fortune. It is not a story about a rich man rescuing a poor one. It is a story about attention, about what happens when one person, in one unguarded moment on a cold grocery store floor, finally stops moving long enough to see what has been in front of him the whole time. James Harris was not waiting to be discovered. He was not performing in the hope of being noticed. He was doing what he had always done, showing up with everything he had in whatever room he was in, for whatever person needed it most. He had done it in uniform in places he couldn't name. He was doing it in a janitor's jacket in a skyscraper he didn't own. He did it the same way in both places, completely without complaint, without an audience. The 43 seconds in the Greenfield Market did not change who James Harris was. They only changed who could see it. And that is both the most hopeful and the most troubling part of this story. Hopeful, because it happened. Troubling, because it required 2 armed men and a gun to a temple before the right person was in the right place to pay attention. How many James Harrises are there? Pushing mops through silent buildings, changing oil in the backs of garages, doing the invisible work that holds everything together, carrying inside them something extraordinary that no one has thought to ask about? The answer is more than we can count. The only question that matters, is whether we are paying enough attention to see them. James Harris taught a company, a CEO, and a city something that cannot be put in a quarterly report or a strategy memo. He taught them that the most valuable person in any room is often the one you never thought to notice. That strength doesn't always wear a title. That courage doesn't always make noise. And that sometimes the entire shape of a life can change in 43 seconds. Not because of what happened, but because of who was watching and what they chose to do about it. Go look at the people around you. The ones who refill the coffee machine before anyone asks. The ones who hold the elevator. The ones who know everyone's name even though no one ever asked for theirs. See them. Say thank you. Mean it. They are not background characters. They never were.